A second approach to studying and understanding class in sociology is the Marxist or relational approach to class. It stems from the work of Karl Marx, a 19th century German scholar, journalist and revolutionary. Marx was a widely read thinker whose work ranged across a number of disciplines, including philosophy, history, economics, politics and sociology. He was also a pioneering political journalist, activist and revolutionary. He opposed slavery at a time when many people supported it, and he was a leader of the movement for democracy and workers' emancipation in the 19th century. At the end of the third volume of his book Capital, Marx asked, "What constitutes a class?" He set out to answer that question by defining the three great classes of his own day: landlords, capitalists and wage labourers. Unfortunately, he only managed to complete 37 lines of text before he died. The manuscript breaks off, unfinished, tantalising generations of readers with what he might have said if he'd finished the manuscript. It's possible, though, to draw out from his writings the main elements of how Marx used the concept of class. First, class is a relationship of exploitation of one group by another. Exploitation occurs when one part of society produces a surplus that's appropriated and controlled by another part of society. Where societies are above the most primitive levels of technology, they can produce their own means of subsistence, such as food, clothing and shelter. They can also replace the means of production, such as tools and raw materials that are used up in the production process. But they can go further to produce an amount over and above that, which is a surplus. When one part of society is able to take control of the surplus and use it for its own benefit, then you have a class society. Major historical forms of class society include those based on slavery, serfdom and wage labour. Slavery existed in ancient Greece and Rome, as well as in the United States in the 18th and 19th centuries. Serfdom was present in the ancient world and was common in the feudal societies of the Middle Ages. And wage labour, which was once a rare form of supplying labour for production, has become increasingly common with the growth and spread of capitalism. In each of those societies, you have a class relationship between the direct producers who do the work and produce the surplus, and an exploiting class which appropriates and controls the surplus for its own benefit. The exploiting classes in each case are the slave owners, the feudal lords, and the owners of capital. Second, classes are groups of people in a system of production defined in terms of their relationship to the conditions of production and to other classes. These relationships differ in different forms of class society. For example, in societies based on slavery, the slaves are themselves privately owned by the slave owners. Slaves don't own the means of production, such as land, raw materials, tools or equipment, and they're not free to leave their masters or to work for someone else. In capitalist societies, on the other hand, wage labourers are not owned by capitalists and are legally free to sell part of themselves, their labour power or their capacity to work, to someone else. However, like the slaves, they don't own the means of production, which would enable them to work for themselves. Third, people in a class may or may not be aware that they're members of a class or have common class interests with others. They may or may not have any feelings of antagonism towards other classes. This is a point on which Marx has been badly misunderstood. Many scholars have taken the view that class only exists when people are subjectively aware of their class membership and interests, and when they feel those interests to be in opposition to those in other classes. One consequence of this view is that if scholars don't find much evidence of class consciousness, then they say that class itself just doesn't exist. However, it's important to remember the distinction that Marx made between a class in itself, where people are objectively in classes and class relationships, and a class for itself, where people are also subjectively conscious of their class position and interests and are able to mobilise to defend their interests. We can now see why Marx rejected the stratification concept of class over 160 years ago, when he wrote that crude common sense transforms class differences into differences in the size of the purse, and class antagonism into quarrels between crafts. He pointed out that class can't be based on income because people with different incomes could belong to the same class, such as two workers who happen to have different incomes. Or people with the same income could belong to different classes, such as a worker and a small business person. Income as a category obscures class differences, making it hard to understand the underlying social relations that generate that income. Marx also points out that class can't be based on craft or occupation because people with different occupations could be in the same class, such as a labourer and a carpenter who both work for wages. Or people in the same occupation might be in different classes, such as an engineer who owns his own company versus an engineer who works for wages. Although Marx died before he could fully elaborate his theory of class, there are more than enough observations on class in his writings then to sustain a distinctive Marxist approach to class that's a clear alternative to thinking of class in terms of stratification. In summary, first, class was a central concept in Marx's analysis of history, society and politics. Second, for Marx, class is fundamentally a social relationship to other people and to the conditions of production, which involves the exploitation of labour. Third, people in class relationships may or may not be conscious of them or feel antagonism to members of other classes. Fourth, Marx rejected the stratification ways of thinking about class, and he provides an important alternative to this approach in sociology.